Thank you, Graham, and thank you to the speakers. It is a challenging role. I had this, it was all neatly ordered and pre-planned because I have the privilege of having been able to dwell on the slides and presentations a bit ahead of you. So I had some ordered, coherent thoughts that I've now scribbled all over and got arrows and all sorts. So I will try to keep some coherence to what I want to say, but also to try to be responsive and to pick up on some of the things which inevitably you emphasise differently and that come together slightly differently. And thank you for the plug for the book and for this afternoon session. So the first thing, of course, is to say that the presentations were very stimulating. The second observation about them is just how different they are. And coming from different bases. And I think that's one of the things that we really must kind of note here. These very different foundations for a very kind of similar set of moves. So Graham always talks about the democratisation of research. I talk about inclusive research, which for me is about pulling in participatory and emancipatory research. There are people who talk about user-led research, user-involved research. There's so many sets of language and sets of people working in different spheres towards this kind of same thing, which is values-led, critically engaged around just disrupting research and what's research for and who's it for and I think, Ed, as you said, the social relations of the production of research has come from some of the disability studies, which would be my background as well. But I think we're at a critical moment, and that's what's quite exciting about that. And for me, the critical moment is that these different kind of moves are beginning to talk to each other. Hurrah! And for me, that's what was so exciting about the book, because I've been writing about kind of inclusive type research, but from a learning disability background, but also in terms of being inclusive of teacher voices, young persons' voices in schools. But what I wanted to do in the book was kind of having older persons' research, all the different spheres. And I learned so much by going to the different debates in different literatures that I think so much can be had from us joining forces and having this dialogue. We're kind of a bit preoccupied with having a dialogue with non-academics, and I hate defining people by who they're not, rather than who they are, by lay people, by advocacy groups, by all sorts of different people. We're obsessed with having that dialogue that sometimes we forget to have a dialogue with each other about the dialogues we're having. So I think that's a really important move. Before I get into the papers, and I'm just going to say a little bit about each one and then sort of head off with some provocative questions, which I hope is what you want from me, Graham. But I want to just start with an anecdote. I was presenting at a day conference of the British Educational Research Association, and it was put on by two special interest groups. One was the philosophy group and one was the inclusive education group. And my paper was about why is the move towards inclusive education, and by that I'm meaning every teacher being a teacher of every child, why has that movement not really joined forces very much with the inclusive research movement? Why have they sort of operated in parallel and not really connected more? But of course, we were a mixed bunch of inclusive ed people and philosophy people, and a philosopher of education who I have the utmost respect for, Herb Biester, kind of said, but why are you talking about the democratisation of research? Research isn't democratic. It's not meant to be. It never can be. That's not, you know, there's an illogic in talking about the democratisation of research. So I want to come back to that at the end, because that's been troubling me somewhat ever since. Okay, let's get on to the papers. These things always stimulate new thoughts for you, don't they? So with Jamie and Graham's paper, because of this notion of connected communities, it was really stimulating me to think freshly, I think, about communities and spaces and about identity and belonging. And I think, you know, what people would say from the disability movement, from the feminist movement, is that real critique that research has been about protecting exclusive communities and spaces, people protecting academic boundaries and identities and not wanting them to be necessarily democratised. So that really got me thinking about democratisation in terms of access, opening up communities and spaces to each other. And I think this reciprocal element's really important, opening up academic research to ordinary folk, but also opening up the lives of everyday folk to academic researchers and making that reciprocal. Thinking about democratisation in terms of equality, redistributing power and influence in and of research. Mutuality, creating kind of bridges and dialogue between communities. And breadth, really, diversifying research bases, this broader notion. One of the things I noted in one of your slides, the call for participants, was that your titles were down as professor and doctor. And this is one of those things from different spheres. In my sphere, I'd have been torn to shreds for doing that, because that's about kind of giving with one hand and taking away with the other. Come and be one of us and talk or whatever. But we've got some academic privilege here and some status that you haven't got. So it's just kind of interesting to see that in different ways. And, you know, it's a cheap shot. And I think one of the things that we do when we try to democratise, try to open up our research, try to kind of follow through on some values, is that we really lay ourselves bare to criticisms like that, to cheap shots, but also to people always saying, that's great, but it's not enough. It's not enough, we want more, or you haven't done enough, or you haven't done it right. And I think that's anti the spirit of it, really, that really we should be respectful of the moves that we're making and the things that we're doing. I think the democratic turn raises some questions that were implicit in some of the presentations rather than explicit. Things like who leads the research, who owns it, who's transformed by it, and whose authorial voice speaks of it. And there's certainly kind of huge questions within inclusive research, which I think were slightly more subtle today. You don't want too much of me, so I'm going to move on a little bit. I think all of the presentations... Pardon? More criticism than the others. More criticism, okay, I'll try. I think all of the presentations highlight the way in which agendas overlap, maybe a little bit or a lot. And that's the agendas of the people we may seek to engage and draw into research, advisory groups, lay users, or people that we want to communicate with in some way. Sometimes we have got shared purpose. If there's, as you were talking about, David, a question that's been generated together or by the people in some way, then there's more likely to be shared purpose, perhaps, than if the question is taken to a group. But I think these different spheres of working in democratisation have come to different levels of maturity at different times, and we're all at kind of different points. But certainly in some of the fields I'm more familiar with, we've come to this point of maturity, I think, where we can say that some of what we're doing in this research has a shared purpose. We're in it together. But some of it is quite distinctive. I, as an academic, want this from it, and I over there, as an advocate or a worker in some way, want something quite different out of it. I've often written down about all of the ideas that's being generated from research, and my co-researchers have said, we don't want ideas, we want action. You know, we don't want talk, we want things to be made different and better. So there is a sense in which this democratisation of research, I think, has to grapple with how much are we talking about shared purpose, how much distinctive. There were echoes through the presentations of who can speak for whom, and this idea of giving voice, which I have to say I'm uncomfortable with. And I would just kind of flag up for people that Louisa Alcoff's paper, The Problem of Speaking for Others, is just fabulous on all of those heavy kind of value issues we have with who can speak for whom. It's a brilliant paper. It's in Cultural Critique. There was a great deal in the papers and in all of this about trust. Do we trust each other to have the knowledge needed? Do we trust each other to have the wisdom, the decision-making? Do we trust each other enough to listen to each other and to influence each other? And sometimes I think these moves to changing the kind of sphere of research is done in very trustful environments, and we work very hard to create trustful environments. But I also kind of want to flag that some of those environments aren't at all benign and friendly and trustful. Some of them are very angry, contested spaces. And we mustn't forget that. And they're angry, contested spaces for very good reason, because research has oppressed and pathologized and colonized. And the people that research has done bad for want to kind of right the wrongs of research. And so I think we can kind of get a bit whipped up into, isn't this all nice and pleasant, and just forget that sometimes it's really bloody unpleasant and angry and difficult, and that's important. Graham, I was really grateful for your input about democracy itself, because I often end up talking about democratic research without feeling like I've got enough of a basis in democracy, so it's really good to get that coming in. I'm sure I'm not alone, and I want to look around and see all the people I know out there. When I say that when you picked up on the things that the skeptics say, it's the usual suspects, no impact, not enough time, etc., etc. I've heard those so many times, and I'm sure there were echoes of around the room. But the awful thing is, of course, that there's truth in all of them. And that's what makes them so important to us, really. Yes, you know, in the field of learning disabilities, there are particular self-advocacy groups that we go to over and over again because they've got good, it's a benign environment, they understand us, we understand them, and they speak for themselves, but whether they can speak for unpoliticised people with learning disabilities who've never met self-advocacy is probably not at all the case. The thing about inclusive research taking longer and costing more, I think I disagree with David, certainly from focus groups of lots and lots of people that I've been working with around trying to make research more democratic, they will all say it takes longer and it costs more. If you're going to do it properly, you can't possibly do it. So that raises the question, what's the added value? What are we trying to bring in here to make it worth spending more and taking more time? How is the product of our research going to be different? And so much of this whole democratisation move has been caught up with process, quite understandably. The process is difficult and challenging, and therefore we've got to talk about the process. But if I go to the literature, I can find hundreds of papers that are either celebratory narratives or cathartic type narratives of we wanted the process to be like this and it ended up being something else, or this is the process we went through and we did. It's lots and lots of reinventing the wheel, lots and lots of process papers. There's very few that actually do too much around the kind of product. What are the products of doing research democratically? How are they different from the products of doing research in a more traditional way? I know there's no one traditional way. Ed, I was glad that you kind of picked up on the slow burn of democratisation. You can take it at any moment and think, oh, this is a critical moment, or this is a time. And yes, it's a slow burn. Graham, you talked about Max Weber way back, you know, and I think about evaluative case study. You know, people have for decades been trying to evaluate things in ways that bring in multiple perspectives. So there is nothing new about any of this. It's a slow burn and a painful burn. I'm nearly there. There were hints sometimes, I think, of this notion of a hierarchy, of how democratic are we, where are we on the hierarchy. You had a kind of a hierarchy. The one that I see more often drawn upon is Hart's ladder of participation. Do people know that? Where you've got kind of like real tokenism at the bottom. And he has as the pinnacle where we hand over research so that users of research are in control of research. And I'm deeply troubled by a notion of a hierarchy anyway, because I think it's always far too simplistic and not nearly nuanced enough. But I'm also worried about the idea where we say handing over research to someone else is somehow what we as academics then say is the pinnacle, because it's almost like talking ourselves out of a role or saying we have nothing useful to say. And for me, that democratisation move has to be about bringing different voices into dialogue. It has to be about having participation but constructive dialogue as a result of that participation, not a handing over of responsibility but a sharing of responsibility. So that's quite an interesting angle. I think there's something in here as well about the technical side, the technical bits in research. I think in some of the evaluative case study, evaluative work around policy and what works. Any kind of what works question always raises the other questions of for whom, does it work for whom, in what ways, and with what other unintended consequences. So I think there's a line of thought there that we might take. So where do we end up with all of this, and where can maybe we can pick up on some of the threads for a most kind of engaging dialogue at the end? The thought I want to leave us with is, does attempting to democratise research change the nature of the beast? Does it change research itself? If you go back to Herb Yester saying, but research isn't meant to be democratic, is there something about we change? Is there something in the idea of we change the thing itself? So I know the title of the session was Democratising Research Methods, not Democratising Research, and I think all of the speakers wandered into democratising research because you can't divorce one from the other. Something you said, Graham, and I pick up on here, is that once we start to broaden that agenda to democratise the thing, then it becomes wider somehow. We get involved with multiple goals. You were talking about these different goals and different priorities. All of the people who took part in my study around, what is quality and inclusive research, were talking about the very many different things we try to do when we try to make research more inclusive. So we're trying to build networks, we're trying to empower, we're trying to upskill, we're trying to listen, we're trying to give voice, share voice, have dialogue. We're trying to do all of these things as well as, or in interaction with, creating new knowledge. And I think sometimes the bit about the creating knowledge gets a little bit lost in amongst all those other wider agendas. I'm really glad to Anne for the idea that she's fed into one of our seminars that we've had of a new space. When we start to democratise research, do we enter into a new thing, or do we just enter into a new space that isn't a kind of academic research space, and it isn't a kind of layperson advocacy space, but it's a new space altogether where we don't quite understand yet the terms of the relationship, the terms of engagement. We're still thrashing about trying to understand them in that space, and I think that's a really helpful idea. Crowley wrote about the dirty work of boundary maintenance when she was writing about the politics of belonging. And I think, you know, maybe instead of trying to prise open the boundaries or make boundaries more pervious, it's more helpful to think of a new, loosely bounded space, maybe. So, I'm going to stop talking. My questions, and people out there, I've got a bright light shining at me, but I know you're out there, will have your own questions, and they're probably better than mine. But my questions are, how does democratising research methods change research itself? How does it change the identities of the people involved? And to return to Gert Biester, can research be democratic? So I leave you with that and enjoy.